And we're really finishing up something, so I apologize, but it is a self-contained topic, so even if you weren't doing the earlier part of it, you shouldn't have that much difficulty. And that is, we had spent the last few weeks of last Siman going over the Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos. And the Rambam's introduction to Pirkei Avos is called Shemona Prakim, which is interesting because Shemona Prakim means the 8 chapters. And of course, Pirkei Avos is only 5 chapters of Mishnah and 1 chapter of Brisa. So this is an example where there are more chapters in the introduction than to the book for which it is an introduction. But the Shemona Prakim is part of the Rambam's Perush HaMishnayos. And as a result, it was all written in Arabic, right? So the original language of the Shemona Prakim, as is all of the Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah, is in Arabic, not Aramaic, Arabic. And it was translated into Hebrew by Rav Shmuel Ibn Tibon, the Ibn Tibon family. The whole family were the great, great translators of the Arabic works into Hebrew. They did the Chovas HaLevavos, they did the Moreh Nevuchim, they did the Rambam's Perush HaMishnayos, they did Emunos V'Deos of Rav Sadia Gaon, which is an earlier work of philosophy that was all written in Arabic and the like. So in Shemona Prakim, generally speaking, the Rambam goes through the idea of developing character, developing midos tovos, because that's what Pirkei Avos is about. And the Rambam develops the important idea that bad midos are called mechitzos. Mechitzos are walls of division that separate you from your relationship to God. And the more bad midos you have, or the worse any given midah you have is, the more of a wall, the more of a barrier you have in your relationship to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So a person must try to remove their bad midos and to inculcate within their personality good midos, because that is the only way they will be connected to Hashem and be able to understand Hashem and have what is called a true knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So based on that, the Rambam has a very, very interesting idea that's almost the opposite. Again, for those of you that were learning this with us, this may be familiar, almost a little bit of a counterintuitive idea. We tend to think, and I think this is the mainstream position of even Chazal, that the purpose of good midos are the virtuous actions that the midos lead up to. Meaning, I could say, Hashem wants you to be a kind person. Why does Hashem want me to be kind? Because by being kind, I will do kind things to others. Meaning, be a kind person, be a compassionate person, so you will do acts of kindness. Meaning, according to that idea, the ultimate goal, and again, as I think this is actually the simple understanding of Chazal, and even of the Torah itself, the ultimate goal is to do acts of righteousness, do acts of charity, do acts of compassion. But if you're a cruel, selfish person, it's less likely you're going to do it. So have midos tovos, because they will lead to virtuous action. In the philosophical terminology, that is called an action ethic, meaning an ethic that predicates action as the highest virtuous goal. The Rambam seems to say exactly the opposite, interestingly enough. The Rambam says, it's not that be a kind person so you will give charity. The other way around. Give charity so it will make you a kind person. Meaning the ultimate goal is the tikkun hamidos itself. And the virtuous action is simply a means to give you good midos, based on the very important idea that actions are not simply the outgrowth of emotion, but actions can educate my emotions, right? We tend to think, because I feel a certain way, that's why I behave. And that, of course, is true. But there's another dimension. You behave a certain way, and that will cause your emotions to go in a certain direction. So this is a very, very interesting inversion. It's not an obvious inversion. People read the Rambam and they just gloss over it. This is not at all obvious. That the ultimate goal is to be a kind, compassionate person, so I gotta do acts of benevolence because that will educate me. That is what philosophers call a virtue ethic rather than an action ethic, meaning to say, instead of virtuous midos cause virtuous behaviors, it works the other way around. Virtuous behaviors will generate virtuous midos, and virtuous midos is the ultimate goal in which I could connect to Hashem by removing the mechitzos, the walls of separation that stop me from connecting to Hashem. That is why the Rambam actually says something that may even have halachic implications. And that is, the Rambam says that if you have a choice between giving $1,000 to one person or giving $1 1,000 times to different people, the Rambam says it is better to give $1 1,000 times, because if you look at benevolence as educating your personality, it is the constant repetition of the action that will bemargil you, that will habituate you in developing a certain midah. And just like in weightlifting, right, it's the repetitions of even a lower weight that will ultimately do more benefit for you than trying to lift a very heavy weight just once and then put it down. Now, the emes is, in the halachic works of the Rambam, in the Mishnah Torah and in the Shulchan Aruch, this is not brought down the halacha. And if you would ask a Rabbi Shaila, hey, I have $1,000. Should I give $1 to 1,000 beggars in the street? Or should I find a cause and give $1,000? Now, l'chayr, if you think about it, it all depends on what you're trying to do. And I'm not sure if we're capable of defining it that way. If my goal in giving tzedakah is I want to develop the midah of being unselfish and being kind and being considerate, then we're back to the Rambam's rule that it's better to give $1 1,000 times. But if I'm giving tzedakah because I want to do the most good with my money, the truth of the matter is giving $1 to 1,000 people does very, very little good. I give $1 to you, what is that going to get you exactly? As opposed to giving $1,000 to a yeshiva or whatever it would be. So tzedakah itself is complicated because there may be multiple purposes which you're trying to accomplish. One is character building, but maybe character building is only one of those purposes. The other is helping people. Helping people might not be the best idea to give a very small amount to a lot of people. Right? I mean, how much have you, meaning if you add up help units, so to speak, the help that you're giving to 1,000 people, each of whom gets $1, is less than the help that you would give one person who got $1,000. Right? It doesn't compute, like you can't just say, well, multiply it by 1,000. Right? 1,000 times $1 is not the same as $1,000. It just is not the same thing. So it's complicated. I mean, the Rambam gives this example, but the Rambam is only talking about it from the perspective of character building. He's not talking about it from the perspective of other goals of tzedakah. So lahalacha l'maisa, you'd have to ask a shaila. If any of you has a lot of money and you want to know how to distribute it, you'd have to ask a shaila if you want to follow the Rambam's hadracha, or there would be other considerations in mind. But be it as it may, this is the idea of tikkun hamidais, and the Rambam, of course, as everyone knows, the Rambam himself was a great doctor. The Rambam was an expert for the time of the workings of the human body. And the Rambam uses many medical analogies to explain spiritual conditions. And the Rambam says, just as physical sickness is a result of what is called an imbalance of the various forces in the body. And again, this goes back to Hippocrates and Galen. This was the standard description in medieval medicine of the 4 humors, 4 fluids that run through the body, the black bile and the red and the yellow and the green, all of those different things. And when things are out of whack, when they're imbalanced in one way or the other, there is physical illness. And if you go and study history of medicine, you will see that the imbalance of humors, as they were called, were the main cause of illness. So the Rambam says when a person lives in a state of imbalance, meaning their midot are not properly balanced, there will be illness, there will be sickness, there will be spiritual sickness. And the same way, when your body is out of whack, you go to a physician who is an expert in the illnesses of the body. So too, when your soul is out of whack, you must go to the people who are experts in the healing of the soul. And the Rambam says these are the chachamim, these are the sages whose expertise, so to speak, is how to have a refuas hanefesh, right? And the Rambam uses the medical analogy, and once again, I'm reviewing again for the number one. We had a little bit of a break, and number two, some of the people here were not in the earlier classes. So those who were, again, forgive my repetition. And that is, this is where the Rambam develops the idea of the middle way. Now, the Rambam says the following: we talk about good midos, we talk about bad midos. But the truth of the matter is, even a good midah can turn into a bad midah if it's taken to an extreme. So let's take generosity. Generosity is good, selfishness is bad. Okay, that's fine. But if a person is overly generous, a person gives everything away, there's nothing left for himself, there's nothing left for his family starves, going to that extreme is also no good. So the Rambam's point is that instead of labeling things as bad or things as good, you have to strive to avoid extremities at either side, and you have to strive to kind of a middle of the road in which there is compassion, but there's also the need to be self-protective. We know this even in friendship, right? One should be willing to be friends with people and give them time. But let's say somebody wants to schmooze with you, like your whole morning seder, a whole day. They want to talk to you all the time. Well, at some point, you got to say, I can't talk to you all the time, right? I have to have a certain amount of boundaries, meaning to say there is selflessness, there is selfishness, but you need to have balance. Now, this, as a matter of fact, the Rambam got from Aristotle. There is no question that the Rambam was a great admirer of Aristotle, and this is what Aristotle calls the golden, well, the English translation of Aristotle is the golden mean, and the Hebrew term for it is Shavil HaZahav, which literally means the golden road, the notion of harmonization of extremities. But I do want to point out that although the Rambam absolutely talks about the middle road, he does not use the phrase Shavil HaZahav. I mean, you'll often find people talk about the Rambam advocates the Shavil HaZahav. He does not use that term. That term is the translation from Aristotle, but the Rambam himself describes it, but he does not use that exact word. And that's the idea that sickness comes when you're imbalanced. So balance means everything is functioning in its right proportion, so you're kind of in the middle. You're not to that extreme, you're not to that extreme. But then the Rambam says, the same way, because he uses medical analogies, the same way in medicine, if you're out of whack, you need to temporarily overcompensate just to get you in the middle. Like if a tree is not, it's supposed to be growing straight, and it's bent over, so all of the branches are going in this direction. What you need to do is, it wouldn't be enough to straighten up the tree in the middle, because it'll just keep on going back. You got to pull it to the other direction. And then the counter forces will get it in the middle. The Rambam says when a person is trying to improve their midos, there may be a need to go to extremities as a temporary measure to get myself back in the middle. Now, the Rambam does not define how long is temporary, right? I mean, the Korean War is technically still being fought in the United States under a temporary emergency rule that goes back to 1952. So emergencies can last quite a long time. Who knows? But the Rambam says that going to an extreme may be a necessary spiritual exercise, but it should be undertaken only on a temporary basis to overcompensate for a spiritual deficiency in the other direction. And this is really the subtext for the famous teaching of Chazal regarding the Nazir. Right? The Nazir is a person who has taken a vow, right, not to drink wine. Now, at the end of Naziris, the Nazir brings sacrifices when he ends his Naziris. And the big question is, why does a Nazir bring sacrifices? Why is there a need to bring sacrifices at the end of a Naziris? By the way, that's why, if any of you are thinking about this, do not become a Nazir today. You might not be able to end it, because Naziris cannot end until you bring the sacrifices. And this is not a joke, because there are people, and I know some people, who have been makabel Naziris, and they're in a kind of a, besides the fact that they can't drink wine of Kiddush, and they can't drink wine of the 4 cups of wine. I mean, there are halachic difficulties. In fact, somebody even asked me, a woman who married a Nazir, married a Nazir, and she has to drink the wine of Kiddush, and she mentioned, is there an issue of kissing, and a little bit of wine might get into his mouth, etc. Well, yeah, she has to be sure her mouth is clean of wine. That's exactly right. Right, so don't try it, because if you do it, you're going to be stuck, unless the base of, well, when the base of Mikdash comes back, you'll be okay, but until the base of Mikdash is rebuilt, you're going to be stuck. But be it as it may, why does a Nazir bring korbanos? So there's a famous statement that Rashi brings in the name of Rabbi Elazar HaKapor, a Tana, that says a Nazir is a sinner because he's sier atzmo min hayayin. He is depriving himself of a legitimate pleasure of wine. Hashem said we're allowed to have wine. Hashem said we can enjoy wine. So why are you more of a tzaddik? You're saying, oh, I'm such a tzaddik, I'm not going to have wine, I'm not going to enjoy the pleasures of the world. That's considered to be sinful. Because if Hashem created everything in this world, and everything, he said, ki tov, it is good. And what is not good for us, he subsumed under the laws of kashrus, whatever it would be. So what gives me the right to say it's not good? So a Nazir who is going to the extreme of asceticism, of separation from the physical, is considered to be a sinner. And yet, the Gemara then quotes a Maisa about Shemona Tzadik, right? Shemona Tzadik, the rabbi of our street here. Shemona Tzadik was one of the early Kohanim Gedolim. Actually, Shemona Tzadik is credited as the first Tana. He's after Tanakh, and he is like the earliest person in the Mishnah that we actually call a Tana, Shemona Tzadik. And Shemona Tzadik was Kohen Gadol, and indeed the Gemara in Yuma gives a remarkable story that when Alexander of Macedonia wanted to conquer Eretz Yisrael, which he did, but he wanted to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. So Shimon HaTzadik came dressed as a Kohen Gadol to plead and pray for Am Yisrael and beg Alexander for mercy. Alexander got off his horse and he bowed down to Shimon HaTzadik and he said, "You are the face that I see in all my dreams that promises me victory or defeat, whatever it will be." And it is said that because of the righteousness of Shimon HaTzadik, Alexander called off his plan to destroy the second temple. And that year, in commemoration of that great simcha, every Jewish boy that was born in Eretz Yisrael was named Alexander. And that is how Alexander became a Hebrew name. Right? A person whose name is Alexander can be called up to the Torah. Alexander. Alexander is obviously not a Hebrew name. It's a Macedonian or a Greek name. But because it was memorialized in this Hakara Sato for that miracle, it now has the status of a Shem Kodesh, that a person could be called up to the Torah. But be it as it may, the Gemara gives a story about Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik made the point that he would never eat, right? There are portions of a Nazir's offering that are eaten by Kohanim. But Shimon HaTzadik never ate from the korban of a Nazir, because he says, Nazirs are sinners, I don't want to eat from their korbanos. But one time only, Shimon HaTzadik says, there was one korban of a Nazir that I ate from, and the Gemara gives a story about a man. It's very similar to the Narcissus story of Greece, in which a person was very, very handsome, very beautiful, had beautiful hair, and he looked at his reflection in the water. And he was so, impressed by how beautiful he was, like Hollywood star, whatever it would be. But then he realized that this would be a Yetzer Hara that would take him down a bad path. So he became a Nazir. Now, a Nazir not only is forbidden to drink wine, but at the end of the Naziris, he grows his hair for 30 days. So in the short term, he was growing his hair even longer, but then he has to shave it all, become bald, take away his crowning beauty. And Shemona Tzaddik said, that guy became a Nazir for the sake of heaven. And the Rambam is explaining, how do you understand the difference? Because if the Aveira of the Nazir is he goes to an extreme, this guy had to go to an extreme, because since he was so enamored with his appearance, he needed the spiritual discipline of going the other way. And that's really a raya to the Rambam's idea that although ideally you're in the middle, but sometimes you need to go to the extreme, right? So this is the famous idea that the Rambam enumerates both in the Shemona Prakim and in the Mishnah Torah itself, in Hilchos Deos, where the Rambam talks about the idea of going in the middle, of not going to one extreme or the other extreme. Sometimes the way we express it in modern language is it is good to be normally, which is just Hebrew for it is good to be normal. Of course, that's a little ambiguous, because sometimes in the world we live in, being normal means being crazy. So you have to be careful in either direction. Okay, but this plays out in a lot of ways. Sometimes in Eretz Yisrael in particular, they write Gedolim biographies, and a lot of it's not even true. It's important to know it's not even true, but they write as praises things that are not really praiseworthy. They'll say about a certain Gadol, he was so great, he didn't know the names of his grandchildren. You got to think about that. Is that great, or is that a little too much? I mean, I knew personally, not well, I was a little child, but Rav Moshe Feinstein. And I can tell you, Rav Moshe Feinstein, knew Shas, knew Shulchan Aruch, knew Bavli, knew Yerushalmi, knew every Prima Gadim, and he also knew his grandchildren at the same time. That, one does not have to be at the exclusion of another. And when you glorify the notion that to be a great person in Torah means you don't talk to your wife, you don't talk to your kids, you don't know what's going on, that's a distortion, really. That's not a Maila. Okay, and the problem is that we sometimes take things which are not really spiritual Mailas and we turn them into ideals, when the ideal should be very much the other way. So when you think about the Rambam's moderation, this is part of what you're thinking about as well, how to apply it to family life. Again, I'm digressing a little bit, but it's important enough that it's worthwhile to just mention it. A Ben Torah, a Talmid Chacham, is also a person that cares about Shalom Bayis, and cares about a relationship with his wife, and cares about a relationship with his children, and shows love and affection and caring to his wife and to his children. And the notion that to be a Talmid Chacham means I ignore all of that is a distortion. And as I say, God forbid, so then you're going to say, oh, Ryder was just criticizing Gedolim. No, I'm not, because the truth is, a lot of the stories that are said are just not true. They happen not to be true, meaning the description of the Gadol. In fact, I told my wife a number of times, I think some of the people who write these admiring biographies of Gedolim are actually secret enemies of the Gedolim. They're actually writing things that are actually negative in the guise of compliments, and they're making it up too. So that's something to think about. So you have to be very, very careful. And again, I know some of you just got to Eretz Yisrael, so I don't want to start telling you anything negative. But because the nature, Baruch Hashem, the nature of Torah here is that it is all-encompassing. And people are, Baruch Hashem, very, very devoted and very, very stark. And that's a good thing. And I hope that all of us will incorporate that in our lives. But like everything, there's sometimes going to be a downside that you have to be aware of, like the undertow, right? You ever go in the water, go in the ocean, and all of a sudden there's something that's pulling you out, very dangerous. And if you panic especially, very, very dangerous. So there is an undertow in this beautiful water of Torah that can pull you out to a very dangerous place. So you got to be careful not to get sucked out by the undertow. I'm using an ominous analogy. Someone has to say? Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, I've heard like this Yesod from the Rambam, but is there anyone else who is there any other like Prakim that say, oh, there's this idea of like the middle path, like that you should go down the middle? Because I know that like with the three avos that two of them, they're like very specifically, oh, this one's chesed, this one's din, and that Yaakov is usually described as the one who took the middle.
Right, that's correct. That Avram represents the extreme of chesed, and although that's wonderful, that produced a Yishmael. And Yitzchak represents the extreme of inner discipline, and that produced an Esav. And Yaakov, I'm just repeating what you said, Yaakov took the chesed and the gevura, and he integrated them, and he synthesized them into the middle, and that is called Tiferes, beauty, because beauty is the harmonization of the opposites. And only from Yaakov Avinu did all of the Jewish people emerge, which shows you the idea of synthesis. So that's a very well-known Kabbalistic idea. But once again, it really comes after the Rambam. So the truth is, the Rambam, again, meaning if you're asking me, can I point you to a Gemara that specifically talks about the virtues of middle of the road? You cannot. But once you have the idea, you can then see that it explains Mamori Chazal. It explains the difference between a Nazir being a sinner and Shemona Tzaddik eating from a certain Nazir's korban. Meaning, a lot of ideas that the Rishonim are the first ones who articulate can then be seen in Chazal in retrospect, even though on your own you would not automatically have seen it there, right? So that's an interesting question in and of itself. I mean, did the Rambam create this, or did the Rambam already see it in the Chazals, or do we see it in the Chazals only after the Rambam created it? But that's kind of the relationship. Yeah.
Your example of like the undertow.
What?
Your example like the undertow. Like
Yeah.
pulling.
Yeah.
What would you diagnose as like the fuel to that? Like what's?
Well, the fuel, again, I mean, we're just beginning as man already. I'm going to give diatribes against yeshivas. I mean, it's, I don't want to get a din b'cheshbon. I also don't want to lose my job. No, the undertow is very simple. The undertow is that it is the job of a yeshiva to teach the importance of limud haTorah and to hear about it again and again and again and again. Ki heim chayenu v'yorech yameinu. This is our life. This is the length of our days. This is the meaning and purpose of our existence. That's our job. And Rebbeim do it, and Rosh Hashivas do it, and this is what you're here for. The undertow is that at some point you might move in a direction in which nothing else makes a difference. And that is the undertow. Meaning, why should I talk to my wife if the only thing is learning? You see what I'm saying? So that's the dangerous undertow. But again, I mean, the truth of the matter is, Torah is the most important thing that we do. We have to be aware of it. But all I'm saying is we have to put it in a framework in which there's shalom bayis, relationship with children, chesed, all of those different things. So the undertow is when it's always the danger of taking an idea that's primary and making it the exclusive and only thing that you talk about. It may suffocate or crowd out other ideas that are very, very important. That's all. It's a simple point that if you always talk about one thing, so other things will get ignored. Yeah.
What contrast does it have with Torah Keneged Kulam?
No. So this is the thing. So Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam does mean that in the hierarchy of values, Torah is the most important. But there's a contradiction even in that, because the Gemara in Kedushin says, why is Torah so great? What is so great about Torah? So it says, Gadol Talmud. Talmud means Torah. Shemevi lidei maisa. Because through Torah learning, it gets translated in the way you behave. Do you see there's kind of a contradiction here? The Gemara in Kedushin says Torah is greater than action because Torah brings you to action. So actually, if you think about it, that actually makes the opposite point. Action is greater because action is the purpose of Torah. But the greatness of Torah is that Torah is the mechanism, the engine that brings me to action. So therefore, what that means is, when my Torah does not bring me to action, it doesn't bring me to virtue, it doesn't bring me to chesed, it doesn't bring me to kindness, then that Torah is defective. That's no longer the greatness of the Torah. Shemevi lidei maisa. You see? So there's a built-in tension here. Torah is greater than action because Torah brings you to action. Right? You see? That's an interesting point. Yeah.
When the Rambam says that spiritual imbalance, you should see a spiritual doctor, I
Yep.
a chacham.
Yep.
Today, is it a therapist? Like, is that replaced it?
So that's very interesting. The Rambam did not discuss, and maybe there was no profession then of going to a therapist or a psychologist. The Rambam clearly saw that spiritual imbalances were spiritual problems. Now today we have this chachma, one could call it mental illness, and many very religious people, including Gedolim, have said that the refuas hanefesh of the Rambam kicks in only when you're fundamentally a healthy person that has particular imbalances. We address them in spiritual ways. But if a person has various conditions, there may have to be treatment for them. So I think that, this goes back to the Stipler, people before the Stipler too, but the Stipler already was living at a time when there was a well-developed mental health profession. The Stipler sent people to, in case people don't know, Baruch Hashem, most of you have heard of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Zichrono Livracha, but Rav Chaim had a great father who was one of the great Gedolei Hador, Rav Yaakov Yisrael Kanievsky, who was known as the Stipler because he came from Horna Stipel in the Ukraine. So, when I was growing up, Rav Chaim was known as the Stipler's son. Now I have to say the Stipler was Rav Chaim's father. But whichever way you look at it, the Stipler would often send Bachurim to therapists and psychologists. So we recognize there's room there. In fact, it's actually very complicated. The relationship of mental health professionals and spiritual healing is a very, very complicated idea. And in fact, this was one of the Chazon Ish's criticisms of the Musar movement itself. If you look at the writings of Rav Yisrael Salanter, and especially his Talmud Mufak, Rav Simcha Zissel, the author of Kelm, you will see that when they talk about changing midos, working on midos, they often will not automatically quote Mamari Chazal. They'll talk about what's called kochos hanefesh, which is aspects of your personality and your nature. And they seem to be incorporating concepts of psychology in terms of understanding the dynamics of personality change and behavioral change. And the Chazon Ish didn't like that, actually. The Chazon Ish did not like the fact that you're looking at kind of a secular discipline of psychology for lessons as to how to change. That was a bit of a controversy the Chazon Ish had with the Musar movement. On one hand, he had great respect to the Gedolei HaMusar. He considered them Gedolei Mamish. In fact, the Chazon Ish once said that he has tinus against the Musar movement, but he has tinus against the opponents of Musar even more, meaning he's more against the opponents of Musar than he is against the Musar movement, because the Musar movement he saw as a totally wonderful objective. But he said some of their means he didn't like. The anti-Musar who said, you don't need to work on midos at all, that the Chazon Ish held was a very bad thing. So that was a big debate, whether psychology should be utilized as a tool. But I can tell you, Rav Olba, Zichrono Livracha, one of the last real Balei Musar of our generation, just nifter a few years ago, he was in Switzerland during World War II. Switzerland was a neutral country, so he managed to escape into Switzerland. And while he was there weren't that many Jews in Switzerland then, he wanted to apprentice with Jean Piaget. Those of you that have taken psychology in a previous life may know that Jean Piaget was considered to be the greatest child psychologist in the world at the time, really one of the greatest in history. And his subspecialty was, how do children develop a sense of right and wrong? The development of moral reasoning and conscience. And since Rav Wolbe, even as a young man, was a Baal Musar, who was interested in how people grow and how people change, he actually worked for Piaget to kind of study. So Rav Wolbe apparently had no problem with going to a non-Jewish psychologist to try to learn about personality development and change. So I think that's kind of an endorsement that mental health professionals can contribute a lot to our Avodas Hashem. Okay, so you are correct that the Rambam does not mention that in particular. And now, that's not to say there aren't conflicts, because again, let me give you some very specific, I don't want to be too specific actually, but I'll give you some semi-specific situations. The typical mantra of a mental health professional is, you got to be free to express yourself. You have to be free to act out the feelings that you have. You can't repress things. You can't hold things in. You can't hold things back. You got to be honest to yourself. I mean, that's the typical mantra that you'll get. And that sounds good, right? That does sound good in theory. The practical problem is, well, gee, how do I balance that with the fact that the Torah says there are certain things I'm not supposed to do, and there are certain behaviors I'm not supposed to act upon? So on one hand, I have Hashem telling me, you cannot behave certain ways. I have a therapist that's saying, in order to be well, you have to be able to act on the basis of your feelings. I'm not going to answer that question now. That's actually a very, very difficult question. But that does show you that even if you're using therapists and everything else, you need a Rav, you need a spiritual force that can help you keep all of that in perspective. It's a very, very difficult question. Yeah.
Can also be that the Rambam assumed that the Chachamim of his time had a deeper understanding of psychology, and that's what he was referring to? When he was saying,
Well, it could very well be. I mean, the Chazon Ish, for example, who, as I say, he very much endorsed the goals of Musar, but felt that there was no need to learn from secular psychology how to address these illnesses. The Chazon Ish felt that everything is ultimately in the Torah itself. The Torah itself contains all of the components you need to develop a healthy personality. In fact, this was why Rabbi Soslanter was criticized, because what are you creating Musar? Learning Gemara is enough. And the Chavetz Chaim gave the famous example that Talmud Torah is the nutritious diet for a healthy person. When you're a sick person, you need special medicine. And the Musar was considered to be the special medicine that was needed. Of course, Musar itself is not a monolithic thing. There are many different schools of Musar. There are schools of Musar that focus on self-criticism. There are schools of Musar that focus on self-esteem. Right? There are opposite approaches of Musar. One approach of Musar is to kind of remind you of how bad you are. And some people are tough enough to take that. And there are other schools of Musar that focus on how great you are. Right? One could be motivated in two directions. Some people can be motivated. Gee, I'm so bad, I better get better. Or I'm so great, how could I not live up to that potential that is within me? Suffice it to say that in our generation, most have said we got to go with the second way more than the first way. But in the olden times, Musar was a little tougher. Right? Look at the Reishis Chachma, which is actually a pre-Rabbi Soslanter Musar, going back to the Arizal. You see a whole thing about descriptions of Gehenim and all sorts of things. There's one of the chapters of Reishis Chachma is called Shar HaGehenim. I do not recommend it for your reading. It's kind of a scary type of chapter. But okay, but there are different shittas, different ways that we reach people. Okay, so this is kind of the framework that the Rambam sets up. Now, we're actually up to the last chapter of the Shemona Prakim, so this was a bit of a survey of the first 7 very, very quickly. And the last chapter is actually the longest chapter of Shemona Prakim, so there's a lot of good meat here. And that is about the notion of bechira. Bechira is free will. For those of you who are new to Ohr Somayach, this is Ohr Somayach's #1 hit topic. If you had to make a list of hit topics across all divisions of Ohr Somayach, discussions of bechira are undoubtedly #1. And bechira is a very important idea. Either bechira or sometimes it's called bechira chafshis, free choice, free will. And this is a very good topic, particularly for the month of Elul, because the Rambam discusses bechira chafshis in the middle of Hilchais Tshuva. Now it's interesting. The very first part of the Rambam, I'm not talking about the Mishnah Torah, I'm not talking about the Shemona Prakim right now. Perek Ches of Shemona Prakim is devoted to bechira, and in the Mishnah Torah, which was written later, bechira is discussed in Hilchas Tshuva. Now, this is a little odd in some ways, because the very first section of the Rambam's code is called Yesodei HaTorah, the fundamental principles of the Torah, and that's where the Rambam talks about belief in Hashem and all these different things. The Rambam does not discuss bechira as Yesodei HaTorah. He discusses bechira in Hilchais Tshuva a little later on. So what is the relationship between free will and Tshuva? So there is actually a double relationship. Reason #1 is that without bechira, there would be no reason to do Tshuva. Meaning, if God programmed me to either be good or be evil, and I am pre-programmed without the freedom of deviating from whatever Hashem implanted in me, then why should I be punished for any sins that I committed? I'm like a machine. So why would I have to do tshuva unless I had free will? Free will, in other words, creates accountability. Free will creates responsibility. Without free will, you're not responsible. Without free will, you're not accountable. Without free will, you are not deserving of blame, nor are you deserving of good when you do good. So free will is the reason why, when I make mistakes, I must do tshuva. But I would add, there's another aspect to it. Free will is the reason I am able to do tshuva. You see, two different points. One is, it is the reason why I must do tshuva. And the second idea is, it is the reason that I can do tshuva. Because without free will, how could I change? How could I be better? I'm pre-programmed. So there's a double-edged relationship between tshuva and free will. It is the reason I must do tshuva. It is the reason that I can do tshuva. Now that's in the Mishnah Torah, that's the tshuva. But in Pirkei Avos, the Rambam is using bechira primarily as the ability to improve your midos. Because again, we're not really focusing. Shemona Prakim is not so much focusing on doing mitzvos as it is as repairing my midos. And that's an important point. We think our midos are fixed. We think they're unchangeable. In fact, even if I think I could do tshuva on actions, but a person does not really think I could improve my character and improve my midos. And here the Rambam endeavors to show us that free will operates in the realm of character as well as actions and omissions. And that is why we have a Maseches called Pirkei Avos, which is about changing our midos and improving. Okay? Thank you. Be well.